I still remember the day they told me I would never see her again. The words came like winter wind through an open door, cutting straight through to my bones. I was 24 then, standing in my father's study with its dark mahogany walls and the smell of old leather books, and I watched his mouth move as he spoke those terrible words. But for a moment, I couldn't hear anything except the sound of my own heart breaking. "It's over, Thomas," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality that only a man accustomed to being obeyed could possess. "The arrangements have been made. She's gone, and you will never see her again." But what they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly understood, was that love, real love, the kind that burns in your chest like an ember that refuses to die, doesn't simply vanish because someone declares it should. They thought they could orchestrate our lives like pieces on a chessboard, moving us apart with calculated precision. They believed that poverty, distance, manipulation, and time would do what their words could not. They were wrong. Now, as I sit here in this chair that has molded itself to my old bones over the years, watching the afternoon light paint golden patterns across the floor of this room where I've spent more evenings than I can count, I find myself compelled to tell you this story. Not because it's extraordinary, though perhaps it is, but because it's true. Every word of it, every moment of joy and despair, every sleepless night, every impossible choice that led us to where we are now. You see, there are love stories that bloom easily in fertile soil, nurtured by approving families and comfortable circumstances. And then there are love stories that must fight for every breath, that must prove themselves worthy through fire and flood, through the very worst that humanity can devise. Ours was the second kind. Her name was Elena Rossetti, and she was the most beautiful creature I had ever laid eyes upon. But beauty, true beauty, isn't just in the curve of a cheek or the way sunlight catches in someone's hair. It's in the way she laughed at my terrible jokes, the way her eyes would light up when she spoke about the books she loved, the way she could find something wonderful in the most ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I loved her the way a man loves only once in his lifetime if he's lucky, completely, foolishly, with every fiber of my being, and that love nearly destroyed us both. Let me take you back to 1962, to a world that seems like ancient history now, but felt so alive, so immediate then. I was Thomas Hartwell, the third son of a family that had built its fortune on steel and railroad investments 3 generations before I was born. We lived in a mansion on Beacon Hill in Boston, with its red brick facade and windows that looked out over a city my great-grandfather had helped build. My father, Richard Hartwell, was a man who measured success in dollars and social standing, who believed that every relationship was a transaction and every marriage a merger. I was meant to follow in the family tradition, Harvard Business School, a position at Hartwell Industries, a suitable marriage to a suitable girl from a suitable family. The path was laid out before me like railroad tracks, straight and unwavering. All I had to do was follow it, but then I met Elena. She was working at Brennan's bookstore on Charles Street, a cramped little shop that smelled of old paper and possibilities. I had ducked in one rainy Thursday afternoon, seeking shelter more than literature, when I saw her behind the counter, her dark hair pinned back in a simple style, her fingers delicately turning the pages of what I later learned was a volume of Pablo Neruda's poetry. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, looking up with eyes the color of coffee with just a hint of cream. And I swear to you, in that moment, the entire world shifted on its axis. "I'm looking for—" I started, then realized I had no idea what I was looking for. "Something beautiful," I finished lamely. She smiled, the first of thousands of smiles that would sustain me through the darkest times ahead, and said, "Well, you've come to the right place. Beauty lives in books. Elena came from a world as different from mine as night from day. Her father, Giuseppe Rossetti, had emigrated from Sicily in 1935 with nothing but calloused hands and an unshakable belief in the American dream. By 1962, he owned a small but successful restaurant in the North End, serving authentic Italian food to homesick immigrants and adventurous locals alike. Their apartment above the restaurant was tiny, 3 rooms for 5 people, but filled with more warmth and laughter than our Beacon Hill mansion had ever known. The Rossettis were loud where we were quiet, demonstrative where we were reserved, passionate where we were controlled. Giuseppe would gesture wildly when he spoke, his voice booming through the restaurant as he argued politics with his customers or told elaborate stories about the old country. Elena's mother, Maria, would hug people as naturally as breathing, would force extra helpings of food on anyone who looked remotely thin, would cry openly at happy endings in movies. They were everything my family was not, and I loved them for it, almost as much as I loved Elena herself. But love, as I would soon learn, is often not enough when it challenges the established order of things. Our families existed in completely different worlds, worlds that were never meant to touch, let alone unite. The Hartwells moved in circles of old money and older prejudices, where bloodline mattered more than character and tradition mattered more than happiness. The Rossettis were first-generation immigrants still fighting to establish themselves, still carrying the pride and suspicion that comes with having to prove your worth every single day. When Elena and I began seeing each other, secret meetings in coffee shops and long walks along the Charles River, stolen moments that felt like glimpses of paradise, neither of us fully understood what we were up against. We were young and in love, and we believed with the beautiful naivety of youth that love would be enough to overcome any obstacle. We had no idea how wrong we were. The first sign of trouble came on a crisp October evening in 1962, just 6 months after Elena and I had met. I'd been spending every free moment at the bookstore, buying books I didn't need just for the excuse to talk with her, walking her home through the narrow streets of the North End, where the smell of garlic and basil wafted from every doorway, and old men played bocce ball in the small parks. I thought I had been discreet. I was wrong. "Thomas," my father called to me one evening as I was heading out to meet Elena at our usual cafe. His voice carried that particular tone I had learned to dread, the one that meant a reckoning was coming. "A word, please." I found him in his study, standing by the window that looked out over the gas lamps of Beacon Hill. He didn't turn around when I entered, didn't acknowledge my presence for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and cold. "I understand you've been spending time in the North End," he said, still gazing out at the street below. "With the daughter of a restaurant owner." My heart started hammering against my ribs, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "Her name is Elena, Father. And yes, we've been seeing each other." Now he did turn, and the look in his eyes was one I had seen him use in business meetings when he was about to deliver a killing blow. "This ends now, Thomas. Tonight." "I beg your pardon." "You heard me." He moved to his desk, picking up a file folder I hadn't noticed before. "I've had some inquiries made into this girl and her family. Do you know that her uncle was investigated by the FBI for possible communist sympathies? That her father was arrested twice for brawling when he first arrived in this country? That the family has debt stretching back 5 years? Each word hit me like a physical blow, not because I cared about any of those things, but because I could see exactly where this was heading. "Father, none of that matters to you, I'm sure," he interrupted, "but it matters to everyone else who matters. The Fairfields, the Cabots, the Adamses. Do you think any of them will welcome you at their tables if you're associated with this immigrant family? Do you think the board of directors at Hartwell Industries will take you seriously if you marry beneath your station?" "Marry?" The word slipped out before I could stop it, and I saw my father's eyes narrow. "So it has progressed that far in your mind," he said quietly. Thomas, listen to me very carefully. You have responsibilities. To this family, to the business that has supported us for 3 generations, to the position you were born to occupy. I will not allow you to throw all of that away for some infatuation with an Italian shop girl. The way he said Italian made it sound like a curse word, and something hard and angry ignited in my chest. Her name is Elena, I repeated more firmly this time, and I love her. Love, he said, with the same contempt he might have reserved for discussion of the weather. Love is a luxury, Thomas. We don't have the privilege of marrying for love. We marry for stability, for the continuation of our legacy, for the good of our position in society. Then maybe I don't want that position. The silence that followed those words was so complete I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the distant sound of traffic on Beacon Street. My father stared at me as if I had just spoken in a foreign language. "You don't mean that," he said finally. "I do mean it," I replied, and in that moment I absolutely did. I mean every word of it. What followed was the first of many terrible fights that would define the next 3 years of my life. My father threatened to cut off my allowance, to remove my name from his will, to see that I never worked anywhere in Boston again. I countered with threats to leave the family business entirely, to change my name, to disappear from their lives completely. My mother, typically, tried to play the peacemaker, but her version of compromise was hardly better than my father's ultimatums. "Thomas, dear," she said over dinner the next evening, her voice dripping with the kind of false sweetness that made my teeth ache, "surely you can see that this girl, lovely as she may be, simply isn't suitable. Why don't you let me introduce you to the Pemberton girl? Margaret Pemberton is such a sweet child, and her family has such excellent connections." But the worst betrayal came from my older brother, Henry, who had always been the golden child, the one who fit perfectly into the mold my father had designed for his sons. "Jesus, Tommy," he said one night when he cornered me in the library, where I was trying to read, but really just staring at the pages while thinking about Elena. "What's gotten into you? You're going to destroy everything Father's built, everything we've worked for, over some girl you've known for 6 months. "It's not some girl," I said, closing the book with more force than necessary. "Her name is Elena, and I love her." "Love," Henry scoffed, pouring himself a scotch from the decanter on the side table. "You think you're the first Hartwell to fall for a pretty face? You think Father never had his diversions when he was young? The difference is, he knew the difference between entertainment and marriage." Entertainment? The word came out as barely more than a whisper, but there was something in my voice that made Henry take a step back. "Look, I'm not saying she isn't pleasant company, but Tommy, be realistic. What could you possibly have in common with a girl from the North End? What would you talk about at dinner parties? How would she fit into our world?" "Maybe I don't want to fit into our world," I said, standing up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. "Maybe I want to build something new." "With what money?" Henry shot back. "With what connections? With what future? Father isn't bluffing, Tommy. Cross him on this, and you'll find yourself cut off from everything, every comfort you've ever known, every opportunity you've taken for granted. Is she really worth throwing your entire life away?" That question haunted me as I walked through the dark streets to meet Elena that night, my hands shoved deep in my coat pockets, my breath forming clouds in the November air. Was she worth it? Was any love worth sacrificing everything you had ever known? I found Elena waiting for me at our usual cafe, but I could tell immediately that something was wrong. She was sitting rigidly upright, her hands folded in her lap, her beautiful eyes red-rimmed as if she had been crying. "Elena." I slid into the seat across from her, reaching for her hands, but she pulled them away. "What's wrong? What happened?" "My father knows," she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "About us." The bottom dropped out of my stomach. "How?" Mrs. Benedetti saw us walking together last week. She told Mrs. Costanzo, who told my Aunt Rosa, who told my mother. She finally looked up at me, and the pain in her expression nearly broke my heart. There was such a fight, Thomas. Such terrible things said. What kind of things? Elena took a shaky breath. My father. He said you were using me. That rich boys like you, they take what they want from girls like me, and then they go back to their own world and marry their own kind. He said you would never really love me, never really marry me, that I was just what? A plaything, she whispered, and began to cry again. I reached across the table and took her hands, holding them firmly when she tried to pull away. Elena, look at me. Look at me. When she finally raised her eyes to mine, I said, with all the conviction I could muster, your father is wrong. About all of it. I love you. I want to marry you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. But your family will come around. They have to. And if they don't? I was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Henry's words, about my father's threats, about the life I had always assumed would be mine. Then I'll choose you, I said finally. I'll choose you every time. But even as I said the words, I wondered if I truly had the strength to keep that promise, because I was beginning to understand that our families weren't simply going to disapprove and then eventually come around. They were going to fight this love with everything they had, and the battle, I was beginning to realize, had only just begun. The winter of 1962 brought more than just snow and cold winds to Boston. It brought a kind of siege to our love that tested every promise Elena and I had made to each other. My father, true to his word, cut off my allowance entirely. Overnight, I went from having more money than I knew what to do with to counting every penny. I had to drop out of Harvard Business School, couldn't afford the tuition without my father's support, and found myself working at a loading dock in Southie, hauling crates and boxes for 12 hours a day just to pay for a tiny apartment in a neighborhood where the heat barely worked, and the walls were so thin I could hear every argument in the building. My hands, which had never known work harder than turning the pages of a book, became calloused and cut. My back ached constantly. I lost 20 pounds in the first 2 months, and Elena would look at me with such worry in her eyes that it hurt worse than the physical labor. But it wasn't just the money. It was everything that came with losing my place in the world I had been born to inherit. Friends who had known me since childhood suddenly became unavailable when I called. Invitations to parties and social events stopped coming. The girl at the bank, who had always been so friendly when I came in to make withdrawals from my trust fund, now looked at me with the kind of polite indifference reserved for people who don't matter. I was learning what it meant to be nobody, and it was a harder lesson than I had ever imagined. Elena tried to help, of course. She offered to pay for dinners, to loan me money from her savings, to ask her father for extra shifts at the restaurant. But Giuseppe Rossetti had made his position on our relationship crystal clear, and accepting help from them would only make things worse. "She's a good girl, my Elena," he had said to me the one time I dared to visit their apartment, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Too good for what you're offering her. Mr. Rossetti, I love your daughter. I want to marry her." "With what?" He gestured around the small apartment, but I knew he wasn't talking about space. "With what will you marry her? You have no job, no money, no family support. What kind of life can you give her? What kind of future?" "I'll find a way," I said, hating how hollow the words sounded even to my own ears. "You'll find a way," he repeated, but there was no mockery in his voice, only a deep sadness that somehow hurt worse than anger would have. "You know what I think, Thomas? I think you're a good boy who believes what he says. But believing something doesn't make it true. And love isn't enough to put food on the table or a roof over your head or medicine in the cabinet when the babies get sick." Elena was crying quietly by the window, and I realized that this conversation wasn't really for my benefit. It was for hers. "You want to know what I tell my daughter?" Giuseppe continued. "I tell her that sometimes the kindest thing love can do is let go. That sometimes we hurt the people we love most by holding on when we should be strong enough to walk away." "Papa, please," Elena whispered, but he held up a hand. "You love her, you say? Then prove it. Give her a chance to find someone who can take care of her the way she deserves. Don't drag her down into this mess you've made of your life." Those words haunted me as the winter deepened and my situation grew more desperate. Because the terrible truth was that Giuseppe Rossetti wasn't wrong. I was dragging Elena down. She was working extra hours at the bookstore to help make ends meet, skipping meals to save money, wearing the same 3 dresses over and over because she couldn't afford new clothes. The light in her eyes, that beautiful spark that had first drawn me to her, was slowly dimming under the weight of our circumstances. And then came the news that changed everything. It was March of 1963, and I was coming home from another brutal day at the docks, my whole body aching, when I found Elena waiting for me outside my apartment building. But something was different about her. There was an excitement in her posture, a brightness in her face that I hadn't seen in months. "Thomas," she said, grabbing my hands as soon as I was close enough, "I have something to tell you, something wonderful." "What is it?" "I got a job," she said, practically bouncing on her toes. "A real job at Beacon Press downtown. They need someone to help with manuscript editing, and Mr. Morrison at the bookstore recommended me. The pay is, Thomas, it's 3 times what I make at the store." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. That's incredible, Elena. That's wonderful. Don't you see what this means?" She was talking fast now, the words tumbling over each other in her excitement. "We can get a better apartment. You won't have to work at the docks anymore. You can look for something in your field, something that uses your education. We can start planning for our future, for our wedding." I should have been thrilled. I should have swept her up in my arms and spun her around and celebrated this incredible stroke of luck. Instead, I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. "Elena," I said slowly, "how did you hear about this job?" Her smile faltered slightly. "What do you mean?" "Jobs like that, at publishing houses downtown, they don't just fall into the laps of girls from the North End, especially not girls without college degrees. So I'm asking you, how did you really hear about it?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm, and I could see in her eyes that she knew I had figured it out. "It doesn't matter how I heard about it," she said finally. But her voice was smaller now, less certain. "It does matter. Because there's only one way a girl like you gets offered a job like that out of nowhere." I felt sick saying it, but I had to know. Someone arranged it. Someone with connections, with influence, someone who wanted to make sure I felt even more inadequate than I already do. "Thomas, please, it was my father, wasn't it?" When she didn't answer, I knew I was right. Jesus, Elena, don't you see what this is? It's not help, it's humiliation. It's his way of showing me that even when we think we're making it on our own, even when we think we're building something independent, he's still pulling the strings. We're still dancing to his tune. "But Thomas, the money comes with a price," I said, my voice rising now, all the frustration and anger of the past months pouring out of me. "And the price is my dignity, my self-respect. The knowledge that my own fiancé had to be rescued by the man who's trying to destroy our relationship." Elena began to cry then, standing there on the sidewalk in front of my run-down apartment building, and I hated myself for being the cause of those tears. But I hated my father more for putting us in this position, for turning what should have been a celebration into another reminder of our powerlessness. "I just wanted things to be better for us," she whispered. "I just wanted us to have a chance. I know, I said, pulling her into my arms despite my anger, despite everything. I know you did. But Elena, can't you see this isn't a chance? This is a trap. The job will come with conditions, spoken or unspoken. They'll find ways to make your life miserable until you quit, or they'll dangle the promise of advancement in front of you while making it clear that your boyfriend is holding you back. This is how people like my father operate. They don't attack directly, they manipulate, they corrupt, they make you complicit in your own defeat. But the worst part, the part that kept me awake that night and many nights after, was that part of me wanted Elena to take the job anyway. Part of me was so tired of being poor, so tired of the constant struggle, so tired of watching the woman I loved sacrifice everything for a future that seemed increasingly impossible, that I was almost willing to accept my father's help, even with all the strings attached, and I think Elena knew it. I think she could see the temptation in my eyes, the way I wavered when she told me about the salary, about the benefits, about the opportunity to finally have something approaching a normal life. That was when I began to understand the true cruelty of what our families were doing to us. They weren't just opposing our love. They were slowly, methodically destroying our ability to believe in ourselves, in each other, in the possibility that we could build something good together. They were teaching us to doubt, to second-guess, to see manipulation and ulterior motives in every piece of good fortune. They were poisoning our love from the inside out, but we held on. Somehow, despite everything, we held on. Elena turned down the job at Beacon Press, and I found work at a small accounting firm in Cambridge. Honest work that paid barely enough to live on, but at least came without my father's fingerprints on it. We moved in together, finally, to a tiny apartment above a bakery where the smell of fresh bread made up for the fact that we had to share a bathroom with 3 other families. We were poor, poorer than either of us had ever been, but we were together. And for a brief, shining moment in the spring of 1963, that felt like enough. We should have known it wouldn't last. If I thought my father's attempt to buy Elena's independence was the worst thing he could do to us, I was woefully naive about the depths to which people will sink to get what they want. By the summer of 1963, both families had moved far beyond simple disapproval and financial pressure. They had declared war on our love, and they were willing to use any weapon at their disposal. The first salvo came from an unexpected direction. Elena's own mother. Maria Rossetti had always been the gentler parent, the one who welcomed me with warm smiles and extra helpings of food when I visited their restaurant in the early days of our courtship. But desperation, I learned, can turn even the kindest people into conspirators. Elena came home one evening in tears, and at first I thought something terrible had happened at work. But when I finally got her to tell me what was wrong, the truth was so much worse than anything I had imagined. "My mother went to see your father," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, behind my back, without telling me. I felt the blood drain from my face. "What?" "She went to his office downtown. She begged him, Thomas. She got on her knees and begged him to help us." The image of Maria Rossetti, that proud, dignified woman, kneeling in my father's sterile office was so horrible I couldn't process it at first. "Elena, that's not—" "She wouldn't—" "She would. She did." Elena was crying harder now, her whole body shaking with the force of her sobs. She told him that she could see what this was doing to us, how we were destroying ourselves trying to be together. She told him that she would convince me to leave you if he would promise to take care of me afterward. Take care of you how? A job, a good job, with good pay. Maybe even help finding someone else, someone suitable. The room seemed to tilt sideways. And what did my father say? He said yes. Those 3 words hit me like a physical blow. My father and Elena's mother working together to destroy our relationship. The 2 people who should have wanted us to be happy, conspiring against us like characters in some Shakespearean tragedy. "But Elena," I said, struggling to make sense of it all, "why are you telling me this? If your mother convinced you to leave—" "Because I'm not going to," she said fiercely, looking up at me with eyes that blazed through her tears. "Because I'm not going to let them win. Because I love you, and I'm not going to let anyone, not my mother, not your father, not anyone, make that decision for me." But the damage was done. The knowledge that our own mothers had betrayed us, had met in secret to plan our separation, poisoned something fundamental between us. We began to look at every interaction with our families through a lens of suspicion. Every kind word, every gesture of support, every piece of advice became suspect, and that was exactly what they wanted. My father's next move was even more diabolical in its subtlety. He arranged for me to be offered a position at a prestigious accounting firm in New York, not through any connection that could be traced back to him, but through a complex web of favors and recommendations that made it seem like pure coincidence. The salary was more than double what I was making in Boston, with benefits that would solve all our financial problems overnight. "It's perfect, Thomas," Elena said when I told her about the offer. "It's everything we've been working toward." "It's in New York," I pointed out. "So, we'll move to New York. We'll start fresh, away from both our families, away from all this poison they've been feeding us." But when I called the firm to ask about positions for Elena, I was told that unfortunately all their editorial positions were filled and would likely remain so for the foreseeable future. When I mentioned Elena's qualifications, her experience at the bookstore, her love of literature, I was met with polite but firm disinterest. That's when I realized the true elegance of my father's trap. The job in New York wasn't an opportunity, it was a separation device. He was betting that I would take the position and either leave Elena behind or bring her with me to a city where she would be unemployed, isolated, and completely dependent on me. Either way, the independent, spirited woman I had fallen in love with would be destroyed, replaced by either a bitter memory or a resentful dependent. I turned down the job, but Elena never quite forgave me for it, though she tried to hide her disappointment. I could see it in her eyes sometimes, late at night when she thought I was asleep. A kind of wondering, a questioning. What if we had taken the chance? What if we had been brave enough to leap into the unknown together? The doubts were growing, metastasizing like a cancer in our relationship, and our families, sensing weakness, pressed their advantage. Giuseppe Rossetti began inviting suitable young men to the restaurant when Elena was working there on weekends. Nice Italian boys from good families, boys with steady jobs and traditional values. He would introduce them to Elena with elaborate casualness, then find excuses to leave them alone together. When Elena complained, he would act wounded, claiming he was only trying to expand her social circle. Meanwhile, my mother launched a campaign of psychological warfare so sophisticated it took me months to recognize it for what it was. She would call me at work, ostensibly just to chat, but every conversation followed the same pattern. First, she would ask about my health, expressing concern about how thin I looked, how tired I seemed. Then, she would move on to gentle questions about Elena. Was she happy? Was she taking care of herself? Did she seem to be thriving in our current situation? The genius of it was that she never said anything directly critical. She never suggested that Elena and I should break up. Instead, she planted seeds of doubt, made me question whether I was being selfish in pursuing this relationship, whether I was asking Elena to sacrifice too much for a love that might not survive the pressures we were facing. "I just worry about her, darling," she would say in that perfectly modulated voice of hers. "She's such a lovely girl, and she deserves every happiness. I just wonder sometimes if she wouldn't be happier with someone who could give her the security, the stability that every woman needs." But the worst manipulation came from an unexpected source. Elena's youngest sister, Rosa, who was barely 16 and had always looked up to Elena with obvious adoration. Rosa began having what appeared to be panic attacks whenever Elena and I were together, sobbing uncontrollably and begging Elena not to leave the family, not to abandon them for a man who would never truly accept her. It took us weeks to realize that Rosa's attacks always happened at the most inconvenient times. When Elena and I were planning a romantic evening, when we were discussing our future, when we seemed happiest together. And it took even longer to discover the truth, that Rosa had been coached, that she had been told by both sets of parents that these emotional outbursts were the key to saving her beloved sister from making a terrible mistake. The betrayal of that discovery was almost worse than everything that had come before. To know that a child, Elena's own sister, had been turned into a weapon against our love was a cruelty I hadn't imagined possible. "They're using a baby," Elena sobbed the night we figured it out. "They're using my little sister to manipulate me." "Elena, what kind of people do that?" she continued, her voice rising. "What kind of people turn children into spies and manipulators?" I didn't have an answer. I was beginning to understand that when people are desperate enough, when they believe strongly enough that they're acting for a greater good, there is no limit to the cruelty they're capable of inflicting. By the fall of 1963, Elena and I were living in a state of constant siege. Every phone call could be a trap, every family gathering could be an ambush, every piece of good news could be a manipulation. We began to isolate ourselves, to trust no one, to question everything. And slowly, inevitably, we began to question each other. "Sometimes I wonder," Elena said one night as we lay in bed in our tiny apartment, the sound of the city filtering through our thin walls, "if they're right. If we're fighting so hard for something that isn't meant to be." "Don't say that," I whispered, pulling her closer. "Don't let them win." "But Thomas, what if they're not trying to win? What if they're trying to save us from something that will only bring us pain?" "Do you really believe that?" There was a long silence before she answered. "I don't know anymore. I don't know what I believe about anything." That was the moment I realized we were losing. Not because our love wasn't strong enough, not because we didn't want to be together, but because the constant pressure, the relentless manipulation, the systematic destruction of our support system and our faith in ourselves had worn us down to nothing. We were drowning in suspicion and doubt, and our families, the people who should have been our lifeline, were the ones holding our heads under water. The end came on a cold December morning in 1963, and it came in a way I never could have anticipated. I was at work, struggling through a particularly complex set of books for a client who seemed to take pleasure in making my job as difficult as possible, when my secretary knocked on my door. "Mr. Hartwell, there's a call for you. She says it's urgent." I picked up the phone expecting to hear Elena's voice, but instead it was Maria Rossetti, and she was crying so hard I could barely understand her. "Thomas, you have to come. Something terrible has happened. Elena is..." The phone slipped from my hand, clattering onto the desk. By the time I picked it up again, the line was dead. I ran. I literally ran through the streets of Boston, my heart hammering against my ribs, my breath coming in sharp, painful gasps. Every terrible possibility flashed through my mind. An accident, an illness, something worse. The blocks between my office and the North End had never seemed longer, and by the time I reached the Rossetti apartment, my legs were shaking with exhaustion and terror. I found Elena sitting on her bed, very much alive, very much unharmed, but holding a letter in her hands. Her face was streaked with tears, and when she looked up at me, I saw something I had never seen before in her eyes, a kind of hollow resignation that frightened me more than her mother's hysterical phone call. "Elena," I gasped, still trying to catch my breath. "Your mother called. She said something terrible had happened. She said you were..." "I'm fine," Elena said quietly, but her voice was flat, emotionless. "Physically, I'm fine." "Then what?" She held up the letter. "This came this morning. It's from the draft board." The words hit me like cold water. Of course, how could I have been so stupid, so blind to what was happening in the world beyond our small, embattled circle? The Vietnam War was escalating, and young men across the country were being called to serve. Somehow, in all our focus on our family's opposition, we had forgotten about this larger threat looming over our future. "Thomas," Elena said, and there was something final in the way she spoke my name. "They want you to report for duty in 6 weeks." I sat down heavily in the chair beside her bed, the full implications of this washing over me like a tide. 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, I would be gone, not just to another city or another state, but potentially to the other side of the world, to a war that was claiming more lives every day. "We can fight it," I said, grasping at straws. "There are ways to delay, to appeal." "With what lawyers?" Elena asked. "With what money? With what connections?" She shook her head slowly. "Thomas, don't you see? This is it. This is what they've been waiting for. They don't have to separate us anymore. The war will do it for them." "Elena, no. We'll get married before I leave. You'll be my wife, and when I come back—" "If you come back." The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. Because that was the truth neither of us had wanted to acknowledge. There was no guarantee I would survive whatever hell awaited me in Southeast Asia. There was no promise that the love we had fought so hard to preserve would outlast bullets and bombs and the 1,000 small betrayals that war inflicts on the human heart. "I won't let this destroy us," I said, taking her hands in mine. "Elena, I love you. I've loved you through everything else, and I'll love you through this too." But even as I said the words, I could see that something had broken inside her. The fight, the beautiful, fierce determination that had sustained her through 3 years of family pressure and financial hardship and emotional manipulation, was gone. In its place was a kind of weary acceptance that scared me more than all our family's schemes combined. "Thomas," she said, and her voice was so gentle, so kind, that I knew what was coming before she said it. "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep fighting everyone and everything for a future that may never come. I can't spend the next year, or 2 years, or however long this war lasts, waiting and wondering if you're alive or dead, if you still love me, if you're going to come back to me or to someone else or not at all. Elena, please. And I can't ask you to carry the weight of worrying about me while you're trying to survive over there. I can't be another burden on your shoulders when you need to focus on staying alive." "You're not a burden," I said desperately. "You're the reason I want to stay alive." "Am I?" she asked, and there was such sadness in her eyes. "Or am I the reason you've already died a little bit every day for the past 3 years?" I didn't have an answer for that, because the terrible truth was that she wasn't entirely wrong. The constant battle had changed us both, had worn away pieces of who we used to be, until sometimes I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back at me. "Our families were right about one thing," Elena continued. "We've been so busy fighting for our love that we stopped nurturing it. When was the last time we laughed together, really laughed? When was the last time we talked about something other than who was trying to separate us this week? When was the last time we were just happy?" I tried to remember, and the silence that followed was answer enough. "I'm letting you go," Elena said, and the words cut through me like a blade. "Not because I don't love you. I will love you until the day I die. But because I love you too much to watch us destroy each other trying to hold on to something that the world is determined to take away from us." "Elena, no, please. We can make this work. We can—" "Thomas." She reached up and touched my face, her fingers tracing the lines that 3 years of struggle had carved around my eyes. "Let me go. Let me go while we still have beautiful memories to hold on to. Let me go before we turn into 2 bitter people who resent each other for all the sacrifices we've made. And so, On a cold December morning in 1963, the love story that had survived family opposition and financial hardship and emotional warfare finally came to an end. Not with a dramatic fight or a terrible betrayal, but with a quiet, heartbroken conversation between two people who loved each other too much to keep hurting each other. Elena kissed me one last time, and I tasted salt tears on her lips. Hers or mine, I couldn't tell. Then she walked me to the door of her family's apartment, and I walked down those narrow stairs and out into the cold Boston air, knowing that I would never climb them again. 6 weeks later, I shipped out to Vietnam, carrying nothing but a duffel bag and a heart that felt like it had been torn in half. The war took everything from me that our families hadn't already destroyed. 2 years in the jungles of Vietnam, watching friends die, killing people I had never met, living every day with the knowledge that the next step might be my last. I came home in 1966, a different man entirely. Thinner, quieter, older in ways that had nothing to do with the passage of time. I never tried to contact Elena. I told myself it was because I wanted to honor her decision, wanted to let her build the life she deserved with someone who could give her the peace and stability I never could. But the truth was simpler and more cowardly. I was afraid that she had moved on, afraid that she had married someone else, afraid that the love that had sustained me through the darkest moments of the war had become nothing more than a painful memory for her. Instead, I threw myself into work. I used my military service and the connections my father grudgingly provided to build a successful accounting practice. I married Sarah Pemberton in 1968, the same Sarah my mother had tried to introduce me to years earlier. She was kind, patient, from a good family. We had 2 children, lived in a nice house in the suburbs, attended the right parties, and belonged to the right clubs. It was a perfectly adequate life, and it nearly killed me with its emptiness. Sarah knew, of course. She never said anything directly, never asked about the woman who had come before her, but I could see it in her eyes sometimes, the knowledge that she had married a man whose heart belonged to someone else. She deserved better, and I told myself that someday I would learn to love her the way she loved me. But decades passed, and that someday never came. I told myself that this was the price of my choices, that this hollow existence was what I deserved for not fighting harder, for letting Elena go, for choosing the path of least resistance when I should have chosen love. I was wrong about that too. The truth came to me on a rainy Thursday afternoon in April of 1995, 32 years after Elena and I had said goodbye. I was 66 years old, recently retired, and Sarah had been dead for 3 years. Cancer, quick and merciless. I was cleaning out the attic of our house, preparing to sell it and move to something smaller, when I found an old shoebox tucked behind a stack of Christmas decorations. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with a faded blue ribbon. Letters addressed to me in Elena's handwriting, letters I had never seen before. My hands were shaking as I untied the ribbon and opened the first envelope. The letter inside was dated February 14th, 1964, Valentine's Day, just 2 months after I'd shipped out to Vietnam. "My dearest Thomas," it began. "I know I said I would let you go, but I find that I am not as strong as I pretended to be. I think about you every day, wonder where you are, if you are safe, if you remember the way I used to make you laugh." I read that letter, and the next one, and the next one, my heart breaking with each word. Elena had written to me faithfully for 2 years, pouring out her love, her loneliness, her regret over the way we had ended things. She told me about her job at a publishing house in New York. She had taken that job after all, had found the courage to start over in a new city. She told me about the books she was reading, the places she was discovering, the way the city lights looked from her tiny apartment window at night. And in every letter, she told me she was waiting. waiting for the war to end, waiting for me to come home, waiting for a second chance at the love we had been too young and too wounded to fight for properly the first time. The last letter was dated December 1965, just a few months before I returned from Vietnam. "Thomas," it read, "this will be my final letter. I received word today that you've been wounded, and while the official report says you're expected to recover, I've heard nothing from you directly in over a year. I have to assume that either something worse has happened, or that you've chosen not to write back, which means you've moved on as I asked you to. I'm trying to respect your silence, trying to let you go as I promised I would. I'm seeing someone now, a kind man who works at the publishing house. He wants to marry me, and I think maybe it's time I said yes. But I need you to know that you were the love of my life. You will always be the love of my life. If there's another world after this one, I hope we find each other there and get to try again." I sat in that dusty attic for hours, reading and rereading those letters, crying like I hadn't cried since I was a child. Elena had never stopped loving me. She had never stopped waiting. And I had never received a single one of her letters. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to call my mother, who was 87 years old and living in a nursing home in Cambridge. "Mother," I said, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest, "I need to ask you about something, about letters that should have been forwarded to me during the war." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice so quiet I could barely hear it, she said, "I was protecting you, Thomas. You were in a war zone. The last thing you needed was to be distracted by that situation." "That situation," I repeated. "You mean the woman I loved?" "She was married, Thomas. She married someone else while you were gone. What good would it have done to tell you that she was still writing, still hoping? It would have only caused you pain. That wasn't your choice to make." "I was your mother," she said, and for the first time in decades I heard genuine emotion in her voice. "It was my job to protect you. You destroyed my life," I said quietly. "You destroyed both our lives." "I saved you from a lifetime of heartbreak," she replied, but even she didn't sound convinced anymore. I hung up the phone and sat in my empty house, surrounded by the debris of a life built on a lie, and tried to figure out what to do with this terrible knowledge. Elena Rossetti had become Elena Morrison, I discovered after hiring a private investigator. She had married her colleague from the publishing house in 1966, just a few months after her last letter to me. They had had 3 children together and lived in a colonial house in Westchester County. Her husband had died in 1987, and she had been widowed for 8 years. The investigator gave me her address, her phone number, even a recent photograph that showed a woman with silver hair and the same beautiful eyes that had haunted my dreams for 30 years. I drove to her house on a Saturday morning in May, my hands sweating on the steering wheel, my heart pounding like I was 24 years old again. I sat in my car across the street for nearly an hour, watching her tend to the roses in her front garden, wondering if I had any right to disrupt the life she had built after I had failed to fight for the one we should have shared. Finally, I got out of the car and walked across the street. She looked up when my shadow fell across her flower bed, and I watched recognition dawn in her eyes. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, in a voice that was older, but unmistakably hers, "Hello, Thomas." "Hello, Elena." She stood up slowly, brushing dirt from her gardening gloves, and I could see that she was trying not to cry. "What brings you here after all these years?" I reached into my jacket and pulled out the bundle of letters, still tied with that faded blue ribbon. "I wanted to return these to you," I said, "and to tell you that I never stopped loving you either. The next part of the story is ours alone. Those hours we spent in her kitchen, drinking coffee and filling in the gaps of 30 years, crying over what we had lost and marveling at the miracle of finding each other again. I told her about my empty marriage about the children who barely knew me, about the successful career that had never brought me a moment's real satisfaction. She told me about her husband, a good man who had loved her faithfully but had always known he was not the love of her life, and about her children and grandchildren, about the books she had published and the life she had built from the ashes of our broken dreams. And then she told me something that changed everything. "Thomas," she said, taking my hands across her kitchen table, "I need you to know that I understand why you never wrote back. I understand why you chose to let me go. Elena, I never chose to let you go. I never saw your letters until 3 days ago." She went very still. "What?" I told her about finding the letters in my attic, about confronting my mother, about learning the truth that had been hidden from both of us for 30 years. I watched her face cycle through disbelief, anger, grief, and finally a kind of wondering amazement. "All these years," she whispered, "I thought you didn't want me anymore. I thought the war had changed you, or that you had found someone else, or that you had simply decided I wasn't worth the fight." "Never," I said, "never for a single day." We both cried then, mourning the life we should have had, the children who should have been ours, the decades of love that had been stolen from us by people who thought they knew better than we did about what would make us happy. But here's the surprising thing about love, the thing that no one tells you when you're young, and everything seems like a tragedy. Sometimes the greatest gift isn't getting what you want when you want it. Sometimes the greatest gift is getting a second chance when you're old enough to truly appreciate what you have. Elena and I were married 6 months later in a small ceremony in her garden, surrounded by her roses and our combined children and grandchildren, most of whom thought we were completely crazy but beautiful in our craziness. We were 76 and 68 years old, and we had perhaps 10 or 15 years left together if we were lucky. We have been lucky, luckier than we had any right to expect. It's been 12 years now since that day I found her in her garden. 12 years of waking up beside the woman I have loved for over 50 years. 12 years of the kind of deep, peaceful happiness that comes from knowing exactly where you belong in the world. 12 years of the life we should have had all along. Elena is napping now in the chair beside mine, her silver hair catching the afternoon light, her hand resting in mine the way it has every day since we found each other again. She's 80 and I'm 88, and we both know that our time is growing short. But we're not sad about it. We're grateful. Grateful that love, real love, is stronger than the people who tried to destroy it. Grateful that some stories, even when they seem to end in heartbreak, are really just getting started. Grateful that we lived long enough to learn that the greatest victory isn't getting everything you want when you're young and passionate, and sure the world owes you happiness. The greatest victory is learning that love, patient love, enduring love, love that forgives and waits and hopes against hope, can triumph over anything, even time itself. People ask me sometimes if I'm bitter about the years we lost, the life we didn't get to live together, but I'm not. I can't be. I can't. Because every day with Elena now feels like a gift we never dared to hope for. And every morning I wake up amazed that we found our way back to each other despite everything that tried to keep us apart. That's the thing about love stories, you see. The real ones don't end when the credits roll. They just find new ways to surprise you, new ways to prove that some things, the most important things, are worth waiting a lifetime for. Our families thought they were protecting us from a future that would bring us nothing but pain. They were wrong. The pain came from being apart, from building lives without each other, from spending 30 years wondering what if. The joy came from discovering that love, true love, doesn't diminish with age or time or distance. It just grows stronger, deeper, more precious for having survived everything that tried to destroy it. Elena is stirring now, opening her eyes and smiling at me with that same smile that stopped my heart in Brennan's bookstore all those decades ago. "Hello, my love," she says, squeezing my hand. "Hello, beautiful." I reply, and mean it with every fiber of my being. We're not young anymore. We're not the passionate, desperate lovers who thought the world was ending because our families disapproved. We're something better. We're two people who have learned that love isn't about defying the world or proving anyone wrong. Love is about coming home. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, home is exactly where you left it, waiting patiently for you to find your way back. This is our story, Elena's and mine. It's a love story that took over 50 years to reach its happy ending, but it did reach it, and that's what matters. That's what I want you to remember, whoever you are listening to this old man ramble on about the past. Some stories take a lifetime to tell. Some love is worth waiting for. And sometimes the most beautiful endings come disguised as new beginnings.